panel starts in 5 minutes. The panel starts in 5 minutes. The panel starts in 5 minutes.
Is my mic on? It is. Hello, everyone. Can we start moving away from the food and in towards the conference? I know that is a tricky thing to do because those desserts were delicious. Okay, so first of all, thanks everyone for being here this morning. We had some excellent conversations touching on Ukraine. Well, my goodness, we started the conference with the three great speakers as well, touching on human rights in Hungary, Belarus, and Russia. And then we spoke about Ukraine, the war and how it's happening. I think we had a very interesting discussion about Russia and about how not just what brought us to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but also, you know, what we think is happening internally as well. And then we had a great conversation about the Black Sea region and the challenges that that region is facing. So now we're going to be moving in a little bit towards the EU, which is an always interesting conversation and is in many ways ever evolving. So I'd like to announce our keynote speech. The Ambassador and Head of Delegation of the European Union to the Republic of Serbia, Ambassador Emanuele Joffre. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for having invited me to give this short address to this conference. It's really a pleasure and an honor for me to be with you. We've seen that you heard from Nobel Peace Prize winners earlier today, Alexandra Matvichuk, Anastasia Garin, and Vladimir Vyalichkin. And the decision towards the Nobel Peace Prize to these champions of democracy and human rights is certainly a sign of hope amidst the darkness of internal repression in Russia and Belarus, and the Russian illegal war of aggression against Ukraine. So perhaps a few words about Ukraine. As we speak, war is raging there, and the Putin regime is killing innocent Ukrainians every day. It is destroying Ukrainian infrastructure, hospitals, schools, and is creating immense economic and energy pain and difficulties throughout Europe and the world. In fact, this is not just an issue of European security, this is putting our whole international order into question. And this is why countering the Russian aggression is a task for the entire global community. President Putin's attack on Ukraine is a direct attack on democratic principles and the rules-based international order. And we need to consolidate our system of values, which is certainly under attack. And the way we respond today to Russian war will determine to a large extent the future of Ukraine, but also of our Union and our continent and beyond. The war is a watershed for the European Union. It made the European Union more united and more determined. And today I'd like to speak of three topics in that context about the future of Europe. I would like to discuss enlargement, how an enlarged union of peace and sustainable prosperity is useful and essential, I would say, in the region. I'd like to talk about the Union as a more independent body to be able to consolidate its model, but also the Union as a global actor, a champion of a rule-based international order, solidarity and cooperation. Because the key issue, in our view, is that we need now to stay united and determined to protect and preserve our system of values and our democracy. Now, first of all, let's remember that the European Union is growing and developing from crisis to crisis. And the recent crisis that we face, from COVID to the Russian war of aggression, have confirmed one more time what Jean Monnet had predicted, that Europe will be built through crisis, and it will be the sum of the solutions found for each of these crises. The European Union is more integrated and has deepened with every crisis. We made significant steps in record time towards a fiscal, energy and defense union. Brexit led to enhancing the cohesion of the union members, and no politician in Europe advocates today for his country's exit from the EU, unlike a few years ago. COVID led to the Recovery Fund, which was a breakthrough for the financial solidarity of member states. We were in the deepest recession since the World War II, and we achieved the fastest recovery since the post-war boom through the 750 billion euros recovery plan, underpinned by EU-issued bonds. That was really because we rallied behind a common recovery plan. We managed to find unity and common solutions. Russia's invasions of Ukraine prompted us to mobilize massively, to use and exploit all aspects of our foreign and defense policy, including for the first time funding the delivery of weapons for a total amount today of more than 3 billion euros. Finally, the war put the restructuring of the energy policy at the core of the attention in order to ensure energy security. And we managed in a few months to reduce the share of Russian gas in total imports of the EU from 40% before the war to a mere 9%. And we're working hard to increase further our energy independence. What is more, citizens of the European Union trust the Union more than before. The European Union enjoys the highest positive image among its citizens since 2009, according to the latest Eurobarometers. I think we can draw a conclusion: when the EU responds to the citizens' needs, when the Union is able to respond to the crisis, citizens are behind it. So in this context, enlargement policy is more than ever a geostrategic investment in the long term for peace, stability, security and prosperity on our continent. And in the last few months, again, very concrete steps were taken by the EU. A few months ago, Ukraine, Moldova and Georgia decided to submit their request, their candidacy for EU membership, because they knew that membership of the European Union was a key to peace, stability and prosperity for their own citizens. And in June, the Council of the European Union recognized Ukraine and Moldova as candidate country and offered a path to Georgia to EU membership. Secondly, in July, after long discussions, accession negotiations were opened with Albania and North Macedonia. And just 2 weeks ago, the European Commission decided to recommend the status of candidate country for Bosnia and Herzegovina. These are three very important political decisions that are now reshaping the enlargement policy and hopefully accelerate the accessions of the candidate country. We indeed envision our Western Balkan partners as future member states of the European Union. And for this very reason, we are already integrating the region in the European Union flagship initiatives. Let me mention a couple. First of all, the green transition, which of course predated the war in Ukraine by Russia, and is a response to the challenge of climate change. The green transition is also Europe's best chance of becoming energy independent, as well as tackling the challenges of climate change. And the Repower EU plan, which will help to reduce EU's and Western Balkans' dependence on Russian gas, is about this green transition as well, encourage energy diversification as part of enhancing energy security. And in that context, the Western Balkan partners have been invited to participate in the new energy platform set up by the EU on joint gas, LNG, and in the future, hydrogen purchase. And through the energy community, the European Union is also opening its electricity market to the Western Balkans. These are very concrete examples of our desire to already now bring the Western Balkans into the EU structures and initiatives. And these are all steps towards a full-fledged membership in the EU, which remains our joint objective. We are working continuously and comprehensively to make it happen, and we're looking for stronger and faster engagement of our Western Balkan partners on the reforms that are needed to align with EU common rules, practices, and policies, and eventually join the EU. As we're working outside, we also need to work inside to strengthen internally our own rules and to make our democracies more resilient. The Commission, for example, will present measures to update our legislative framework for fighting corruption in the coming year. We will raise standards on offenses such as illicit enrichment, trafficking in influence, and abuse of power, beyond the more classic offenses such as bribery. We'll keep insisting on judicial independence and protect the EU budget through the conditionality mechanism. And work is underway to protect and better empower media, and the Commission in September presented the European Media Freedom Act, a new set of rules to protect media pluralism and independence inside the EU. As a matter of fact, we need to defend ourselves against foreign autocracies who resort to hybrid warfare against our democratic model. Foreign interference, and in particular foreign disinformation and information manipulation, poses a clear threat to our democracy, our society, our stability, and eventually our security. Russian state media and the ecosystem around them are, for example, being used as instruments to push false narratives, to manipulate and to mislead. And they are an integral part of the aggression. Russia is not just bombing houses, infrastructures, people, but they're also bombing people's minds and spirits, including in the Western Balkans. We need to better shield ourselves from malign foreign interference that is spreading disinformation from the internet to the halls of our own universities. This is why the Commission will present a Defense of Democracy package in the spring. And of course, this is not only about Europe inside the European Union, it's also about our closest partner. So we need to work hard to build resilience also in the states of our friends, to counter malign interference and manipulation of information. We are stepping up our support to independent media and civil society and investing in digital and media literacy. And Commissioner Jourova, the Vice President of the Commission, will certainly provide you more details on this important aspect and policy line. The second element, of course, is that the European Union needs to become more resilient, strengthen its autonomy, strategic autonomy. The Vice President of the Commission, High Representative Borrell, a few days ago, gave a speech to the EU ambassadors and highlighted how our prosperity has long been possible thanks to cheap energy coming from Russia and access to big Chinese market for import and export. And we need to rethink these models because some of the assumptions on which we were based are no longer true. And certainly we need to find new ways for energy supplies from inside the EU because the one produced at home is always the safest energy source. But all these changes will produce strong restructuring of our economy. So we need to be prepared and embrace this change and manage them. We also need to be prepared to shoulder more responsibility when it comes to ensuring our own security, for which we've been heavily relying on our close friends in the US. European security and defense has evolved more in the last few months than in the last 2 decades. We continue working hard to build a defense union, and we have started implementing an ambitious plan of action for strengthening EU security and defense policy by 2030 called the Strategic Compass, which foresee the development of capabilities but also strengthening the partnership with our closest friends. But the aggression on Ukraine has also prompted very concrete actions in the last few months and weeks. For example, as part of the European Peace Facility, the EU foreign ministers agreed to establish an EU military assistance mission to support the Ukrainian armed forces, which will train around 15,000 troops on EU soils. And as I've said, more than 3 billion euros have already been allocated for purchasing weapons to assist the Ukrainians to defend themselves against the aggression. Also, a few days ago, upon request of Armenia, the European Union deployed a monitoring capacity mission to monitor the situation at the border region between Armenia and Azerbaijan. The objective of this mission is to support confidence building between the two countries and to allow the EU to better support the work of the Border Commission. That was an example of very rapid reaction to a request coming from two partner countries in the Caucasus. Thirdly, the European Union needs to continue to be a key actor in promoting a rule-based international order that supports solidarity and international cooperation. The willingness to work with partners on all issues is a hallmark of the EU support to multilateralism. It builds on the vital agreement and relationship that connect the European Union not only with its closest neighborhoods, the Western Balkans, its southern and eastern neighborhood, but also beyond that, Africa, the Indo-Pacific, South America, and the Gulf. It draws on a shared respect for the UN Charter, which is now more relevant than ever, as well on agreed values and principles. So we will remain steadfast supporters of multilateral solutions to global problems, from climate change to nuclear non-proliferation. We also need to offer effective solutions to our partners if we want to maintain the attractiveness of a rule-based and value-based multilateral order. A year ago, the European Union launched the so-called Global Gateway Investment Programme. And since then, the demand for a strong and value-based infrastructure investment program has only grown stronger. COVID-19 highlighted the urgency, for example, of investing in resilient health system, but also in digital infrastructure. Also, more and more countries are dealing with the rise in energy and food prices, and we need to give concrete answers to these problems. And also we've seen that the Belt and Road debt crisis is now in full swing. So the Global Gateway is a response to this situation, an opportunity to end unhealthy dependency and invest in partnership of equals instead. And I come to the conclusion of my intervention. If we look at facts, there are certainly many challenges around us, but the EU is enjoying the highest level of support, both internally and externally. Unity is the only solution to the ongoing security crisis, and the enlargement process is more than ever a geopolitical investment, and the Western Balkans countries should use this window of opportunity to advance towards accession. The President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, is visiting the region these days. She's actually heading to Tirana as I speak, and she'll be in Belgrade tomorrow. Her visit is a clear demonstration of our commitment and determination to bring the accession process forward and provide concrete answers to people's problems. We all know that the path towards accession goes through reforms. And this is the winning choice for the region, for Serbia, and for the European Union. Thank you very much.
Where's the video? Okay, hello. Lights up. All right. Uh, so welcome. So thank you very much, Ambassador Geoffrey. Very interesting to hear what you had to say, and thank you very much for joining us today. So I would just like to introduce this panel, panel 4, but also there's panel 5 happening, Energy Diversification in Southeast Europe, next door in Crystal Hall 2. So if you're in the wrong room, that's okay. We won't be offended if you have to get up to leave. But this panel here is EU enlargement in new geopolitical circumstances, how to use the new impetus. And on here it says that the panel is Klimen Groschel, Luka Steric, Ivetza Zapesci, Serjan Mastorovic, and Nikola Burezer. So thank you all very much. I'm missing one, but I will slip away now and let the panel begin. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon from my side. It's nice to see a full house, especially after lunch. And we are here now gathered to discuss one of the most burning issues at the moment, which is the EU perspective of the Western Balkans in the context of changing geopolitical circumstances and security threats to Europe, which we're witnessing this year. As you may know, the Russian aggression on Ukraine on 24th of February has drastically changed geopolitical circumstances and brought serious security concerns for the entire European continent. Conventional warfare has returned to Europe after several decades, and nobody can really exclude even the possibility of a nuclear war. In these circumstances, the enlargement process has found itself in the last years in a sort of a stalemate. Different issues such as the problems with rule of law and democracy in the countries themselves, bilateral issues between countries in the region and between countries in the region and EU member states, as well as the apparent lack of appetite for enlargement among EU member states have put this process into question. Coming into 2022, we have actually seen how the Russian invasion of Ukraine has opened up a new debate about EU enlargement, about the importance of the Western Balkans for European security and stability, and reinvigorated the debate about what needs to be done with enlargement to make the process successful at the end. So it has brought some opportunities, on the one hand, by opening up this debate and by elevating the Western Balkans in the security sense. But at the same time, it has brought, I would say, serious security challenges to the region and therefore brought into question the security and stability of the region itself. So if we look at this entire context, could we say that these new geopolitical circumstances, tragic as they are opportunity for the Western Balkan countries, or another obstacle that we have to face now on our way or in our dream to join the European Union one day? Let me begin with this first general question. Did the new geopolitical circumstances represent opportunity or an obstacle, or maybe both? Mr. Steric, let's begin with you.
Thank you, Nicola, and I would like to welcome everybody from BCSP team, from the side of the BCSP team to the conference. So I would start with the conventional wisdom, which is that this new geopolitical framework, as difficult as it is, has opened some new possibilities for the Western Balkans by bringing the spotlight back on the region, which has been neglected for more than 10 years, at least. But I would I would leave it for the other speakers to speak about opportunities, because I think that there's a major concern to tackle here, and this is the fact that this geopolitical circumstances would put geopolitical interests and concerns on top of the European agenda when it comes to the approach to the region, and therefore a continuation or even empowerment of what we have seen for the last 10 years at least, and this is the dominant European approach when it comes to the region, and this is the so-called stabilocracy support, or the political support to stabilocracy. And by stabilocracy, what I mean is this approach in which EU has turned a blind eye to lack of reforms and even democratic backsliding in many of the countries of the Western Balkans, effectively putting enlargement on hold, and supporting, passively at least, the status quo in exchange for some type of stability and for European presence or actually European influence to be the dominant one in the region. And I think this approach has led, or actually contributed greatly to a region becoming less secure, actually, less democratic, and European influence fading in the region over the last decade. And by less secure, I think we are facing probably the most serious security dangers since the 1990s, at least, within this region across the board. We also see democratic backsliding to a various extent in many of the countries of the region, probably with Serbia as the captured state, I would say, on top of this list. And finally, we have seen the EU credibility and legitimization of the EU agenda fading in the eyes of much of the public in the Western Balkans, especially the ones, and I think this is important, of those who are the most pro-European, actually, in these societies. And I think long-term, this presents major challenges for the EU influence in the region, and also, of course, about the whole idea of EU enlargement as a whole. And I think, to finish with this, we need a new approach, which would put, once again, but truthfully, reforms in the center and actually see if we can enhance the EU enlargement process once again as a force of democratization of rule of law reforms.
Thank you very much. Mr. Majstorovic, what are your observations and maybe comments to what Mr. Cecek has said?
Well, let me start by saying a big thank you to Belgrade Center for Security Studies for keeping the torch alive and for keeping Belgrade on the map of big conferences dedicated to important issues. And my answer very shortly would be we need to snap out of this kind of a small town mentality that is very present in the region. It seems that we are looking at a Russian aggression on Ukraine exclusively through the lenses of our region. While I think that what is going in Ukraine is much larger. It's a joint and common threat to a common future. And as such, I see this, how to put it, repulsive atrocities which are going on in Ukraine as a signal of what Europe might be if we do not put our strategic hats on and start thinking of what Ambassador Joffre was saying, and this is thinking about a common future and common Europe in the next 50 years. The war in Ukraine is the war against rights to self-determination. It's a war against people's rights to decide about their destinies. And as such, it's much larger than just, taking a snippet point of view on this phenomenon as a, opportunity or risk. It's a challenge, and it's a common challenge. As such, the Western Balkan countries have to find a way how to actually contribute to resolution of this conflict. First and utmost, sitting in the capital of Serbia, it would be important that the new government adopt the decision finally to harmonize its foreign policy with the EU common and foreign policy in general. This is becoming one of the fundamental issues in the EU integration process in general, and it needs to be said very clearly and loudly that those who are not capable of playing the team game and feeling the spirit of the moment are going to have a very tough time joining the club. And I'll stop here because I know you wanted this to be a very dynamic exchange, so let's keep it like that.
Thank you very much. Ms. Epeshi, you come from a member state which is usually accused of being skeptical when it comes to enlargement. We have heard now, actually, also from Mr. Joffre, that there is this unity within the European Union when it comes to addressing the Russian aggression on Ukraine. But could we say that now there is a newfound cohesion and unity among your member states when it comes to enlargement in the Western Balkans as well? This is the impression we get in the last few months, but do you share the same impression?
Yeah, I think I would share that impression. First of all, thank you very much as well for inviting me to this interesting discussion. I would fully agree with the EU ambassador about the EU unity that has been demonstrated since the war started, and that it's quite exceptional and also maybe a momentum for this region. We've seen how the EU reacted to Ukraine in full support and also full solidarity. We've seen how the EU has reacted to Russia with firm and strict sanctions that are unprecedented. And we've seen how most of the countries in this region have aligned with the EU common foreign and security policy and have stood behind both Ukraine and the EU in this awful war. So I think looking at this region, this EU unity has also been translated to the region and to the interest of the EU in the region, I would say. And this is an opportunity for the region to increase the work together and to increase, working towards enlargement together. Because now it's very clear that this European family, this idea of, oh, we're in this together on this continent and we are facing together this awful crisis, is a momentum to really engage and speed up the process and make sure that this family becomes tighter and more close. So I think we can use enlargement to do so. I fully agree with you as well that the reforms have been lagging behind, so we have to continue to focus on that. But there's definitely a new momentum, and we feel it as a member state, we feel it in terms of EU unity, but we also feel it in terms of the political debate in the Netherlands, as well as in how society looks at the EU, but also at enlargement, I would say.
Thank you very much. Let us turn to Mr. Groschel, who is joining us online. Namely, you're a member of the European Parliament, which is known to be quite vocal about the importance of enlargement, basically, and has been so in recent years. What is your impression? Is now a new opportunity? Is there now this newfound focus on enlargement, at least when it comes to the European Parliament and the parties represented there? Or nothing has substantially changed in this turbulent year?
Thank you for having me, even though in this remote fashion. I do apologize, but my agenda didn't allow me to be physically present in this very important conference. So, does the Ukrainian war means a new opportunity? I would say there are opportunities, obstacles, and let's say also risks and dangers regarding the enlargement of the European Union to the Western Balkans. Of course, there is absolutely the first and the most important thing to which needs to be pointed out is that there is a political understanding among the member states and institutions that we need to do something regarding the Western Balkans, not to allow other global and regional players to take over the whole story and cause us problems. But this something is not yet finally defined. I see that the Commission, and this is, I would say, a very positive development, has stepped in with some initiatives like the proposing the candidate status for the Bosnia and Herzegovina, getting a little bit more involved, which is evident from President von der Leyen's engagement in these days in the Kosovo, Albania, and Serbia. But of course, there are some questions which are not yet answered, and this is in regard, will this unity which is now established regarding the Ukrainian war and the Russian aggression, will this be translated and reflected to the Western Balkans? Some signs are saying yes, there are also signs saying no. I would say the obstacle, of course, one of the obstacles which might occur is that focus of the European Union and also the international community is now on developments in the so-called Eastern Partnership, because they are the most intensive developments from the geopolitical and geostrategic point of view. What are the risks? We are not talking about the risks. One of the risks is that we could get caught in the geopolitical trap, which would mean that there will be some sort of appeasement, which was already mentioned in a little bit different form. What I mean by appeasement, that's the political interest of, let's say, some of our member states and also our allies would be just to have a stable situation in the Western Balkans, not to allow, let's say, Russia to destabilize it, and not taking into account, into regard, the issues which are crucial for the enlargement and for the accession of the Western Balkans country into the European Union. These are issues mostly related not that much to the economic development, even though this is supported by the part of the Commission, especially by one commissioner. If we are a little bit frank, and of course the question of basic values, rule of law, democratic development, and backsliding in this sense is evident in the region. And the other trap, I would say, is that there is the question of returning when the war will drag on, returning back to the business as usual. And in this sense, nothing happened in the Western Balkans. Let it stay this way. And this is one of the risks I think we are underestimating. But I would say that despite all these challenges in front of us, I'm still more optimistic about the enlargement process as it was in 2019 when I started dealing this in the political field.
Thank you very much. I believe we have all agreed here that the security threat has kind of elevated the importance of the Western Balkans, but we have heard here an argument that is actually not a good thing for enlargement. So you have mentioned stabilitocracy as a phenomenon, and the usual argument of stabilitocracy goes that it's basically a principle of dealing with the Western Balkan countries in the way to prioritize stability over reforms that are actually going to bring EU integration. Do you believe that now we're seeing some kind of a new momentum, like a new form of stabilitocracy, where there actually is going to be EU enlargement, but under different rules? With prioritization of maybe foreign policy alignment and security, let's say, alignment, but not caring so much about rule of law and democracy once again?
Yeah, there are actually, I think, two sides to this story. One would be to have some kind of incentives for countries to align geopolitically with the EU, and not giving them actually an open door to actually enlarge in the long run. So in this sense, the whole idea of the accession process as a reform process was from the very beginning that incentives have to be connected to the reforms in the rule of law. If you have some other incentives, such as the geopolitical incentive, then taking the place of the rule of law reforms, then this might incentive actually countries of the region to go forward with the business as usual, which is in this case with a democratic backsliding, and in return to just geopolitically align as a non-member. And I'm afraid we can discuss about this later, that maybe European political community might be one of these, ideas. The other version would be to include the region solely based on the geopolitical alignment, regardless of the reforms that are actually non-functioning democracies as we see them now. I don't think that's necessarily going to happen, because I think that EU members are, regardless of the geopolitical risks, not willing to accept non-functional democracies in their scope. Nonetheless, even if it would happen, I think that would be bad news both for the EU in the long run and also for the citizens of the region, because the whole allure of the accession process from the very beginning was that it can be the driver of democratization and the agent of the change in the region. And if it's just a matter of joining the club and becoming, maybe to be quite direct, new Hungary in the team, then maybe that's not really good news either for the citizens of the Western Balkans.
Mm-hmm. Well, the name of our event is actually linking authoritarianism with war, and could we say that the events in Ukraine have actually put an alarm bell to the European Union to understand better the dangers of authoritarianism? So basically, how can this now affect EU's policy on the region? Like, is the EU going to be less tolerant to autocracy after witnessing what happened in Ukraine after the Russian invasion?
I mean, we would hope so, but I mean, we have to notice that for the last 10 years or so, EU was not, out like it was present in the region. It has followed the changes that were happening. I don't think that EU has been, without eyes being open for a long time. And regardless of this, I mean, we have seen statements of many EU officials, member states, but both member states and the EU level, some kind of a, legitimization and support for stabilitocracy regimes, which were very often authoritarian, concretely about, for example, Serbian regime. So in that sense, I don't think this is much of news. Maybe it will be alarm bell on what can happen long term if you support this kind of system. So let's see, maybe, I mean, this might be an agent of change within the EU about thinking about the enlargement process in general. This is our hope, at least.
Thank you. Mr. Majstorovic, how do you see this? Is this new stabilitocracy or some kind of changed stabilitocracy a danger for the Western Balkans, having in mind the focus on stability and security after the Russian invasion?
Well, answer could be very short. Yes, of course. There is a risk. And we need to be very open at the gatherings like this, where we are coming from different sides. We need to be very open that, unfortunately, in a time of security crisis, issues regarding functioning democratic institutions, certain controls, are sometimes being jeopardized for the sake of security. And that could be a very dangerous trap that the region can step in. And obviously, nobody would like to go that way, but the events will basically decide what's going to happen. How to mitigate this risk is to be persistent in the narrative that has to be very clear and open. We're witnessing these days in Serbia especially that the highest officials are saying if we resolve issues with Kosovo, we could become a member state the next day. It's simply not the truth. It's not either Kosovo, either human rights, either democracy. It's resolvement of Kosovo issue and democracy. And that needs to be communicated each and every time the high-level officials are visiting Serbia. There are some also strategic EU policies which might contribute to what we are saying here, and this is to create a sort of an atmosphere for democracy and democratic practices. Recently, the European Commission has published communication on raw materials, where again, certain raw material which apparently is very present in this country is being put on the top of priorities. That could also be a side interest that could influence democratic processes in this region. So we need to remain vigilant, and we need to remain true to what was written in the book of negotiations, in the framework for the accession talks with Serbia, which says democracy, rule of law, democratic institutions, freedom of speech, free media, resolution of Kosovo issue. From the day one, these conditions are there. They're not changed. And I must say, I was very surprised to hear the old new prime minister saying that some of these conditions are new, that they're changing, and that sometimes they're simply rude towards Serbia. This is the product of how to put it, an unclear narrative and messages that needs to constantly be sent to the countries in the region. So there is no choice, there is no accession à la carte. I will contribute to this and not to this. And this is why the whole process needs to be taken back to its root, to regain the transformative power, to have this transactional nature. If you do good, you're going to be rewarded for that. If you do not progress, then you might get punished for that. In order to make the cost, the price of non-compliance with the requirements, which are clear, as I said, from the day one of the accession talks, very high and politically risky.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Ms. Ebeshi, you come from a member state which is known to be very strict on rule of law, or at least putting lots of emphasis on the rule of law when it comes to not only enlargement, but actually within the EU itself. Do you believe that this emphasis on security, which we see right now, can lead to some shortcuts for membership of the Western Balkan countries, or no shortcuts can actually be made and basically the rules and the requirements remain the same?
No, I would say no shortcuts on the rule of law. We believe that enlargement should actually strengthen the EU. And how do you do that? That is by adding to the EU full-fledged democracies that have a solid rule of law base. And then I think the EU could be strengthened with any of the countries in the Western Balkans joining, hopefully in the near future. But these criteria, they remain the same. And we understand, of course, that there are external challenges now that have increased compared to the past. And of course, it's also very important that future EU members align with common foreign and security policy. This is one of the requirements, and we do expect that from all future EU members, including from Serbia, that is clearly not ready to do that yet. But the fundamentals, the focus on the fundamentals remains the same, and you talked about it in the case of Serbia, but it actually applies to all candidates, of course. We have the Copenhagen criteria at the core of the enlargement process, and as far as we're concerned, that is for a very good reason. And we see what happens if countries slide back, and that has a direct impact on the stability of the region. And that's why we think that these rule of law criteria, they remain at the core. And of course, also in addition to that, we should focus a lot on alignment with common foreign and security policy, with sanctions, with visa policy. Things like that are also very important.
So I think we find ourselves now in a problem. We have all here concluded that it is very important for the European Union to enlarge in the Western Balkans, especially given this security threat that currently exists. But at the same time, we heard, and we can all here concur, that basically the rules can remain the same. The obstacles can remain the same. We still have all the issues we previously had with rule of law. We still have the same requirements when it comes to bilateral issues, so chances for member states to block individual Western Balkan countries. We have the Kosovo issue yet unresolved. We have the foreign policy issue the same way we had before. So we have all the same problems, but now more need to actually complete the enlargement process. So the question is, how do we deal with this? How do we resolve the problems that we were all unable to resolve in the past 10, 15 years, now that we are all, let's say, more serious about this? Mr. Gosha, looking from the European Parliament, what are your ideas about how to resolve this problem? So how to deal with the fact that the problems are there, that they have proven to be non-resolvable in the last couple of years, but at the same time to actually make the process work?
The answer is very simple and also at the same time very complex. By implementation of the basic values and principles upon which the European Union is based.
But how? That's the question. That's the question.
Yeah, that's very simple. You know, if you want to be member of the European Union, you should not only, I would say, accept the legal framework, but you need to implement it. If you want to implement the foreign policy, the principles of common foreign security policy, then you should do everything possible to resolve your open issues with your neighboring countries on the principles on which the European Union is based upon. You know, this can be also a challenge for the member states. There are some issues, you know, also between Slovenia and Croatia, but there is a solution. We accepted some solution. At the end, it was not, let's say, accepted completely, but at the end, we have mechanisms which are available. So the countries in the Western Balkans could simply take the same mechanisms for resolving their bilateral issues. On the other hand, this is also the political issue. The political issue is how will the politics in the Western Balkans slowly change from the politic based primarily on the nationalistic issues to more issues which are relevant for the well-being of the people in the Western Balkans. You know, if you have political parties which exclusive issue is how to issue some more or less, I would say, national identity issues which should be already solved, and if this is the only political program they have, then you have a problem, you know, because when you are entering the process of negotiation, there are several topics. You have clusters which are not obstacles, but they are conditions which aim is not to prevent someone from entering the European Union, but for making the candidate country more adept to entering common market, common internal market, common rule-based system of decision-making, and all the benefits which made the European Union one of the most developed and still the most attractive part of the of the world. And by doing this, the precondition is very simple. You need to have a functional democracy. Because we saw it, what happened with Hungary, and with also to a certain extent with Poland. But this is something which is not acceptable, because Europe is based on democratic ideas. Because we knew, because Europe was established after learning the lessons in a very hard way. What I'm afraid is that in the Western Balkans, some political forces, especially in Serbia, are still caught in the politics of the past, and since they don't have the solutions for the problems, either economic one, either social or demographic, they are returning back to the politics of the past. But in reality, what modern politics needs to address is the issues which are faced by the society. So I think that there are many other issues, and if these are addressed, then the process of enlargement or also negotiation will be quite smooth and quite quicker, also in the Western Balkans. But this is internal political process. It was the same in Slovenia. We had to go through the same process, figuring out how to place, and when you figure out this on political level, then you have the solution how to do this negotiation the best possible way for your country as a candidate country.
But what can we do with the EU enlargement process to motivate or pressure all the relevant actors to change their behavior? So to motivate the Western Balkan governments to actually implement the necessary reforms, to prevent EU member states from using bilateral disputes to block enlargement, also to prevent EU member states from stopping enlargement due to some of their own internal issues, as happened in previous years when it comes to North Macedonia. So do we need to reform the system? Is the system broken? Do we maybe need some kind of a new discussion about enlargement? Some let's say new fora for discussing it. So what is the resolution to this?
I would say the only answer is a political will. Look, we are talking about this Bulgarian blockade of Northern Macedonia. This happened to Slovenia also. Italy was blocking Slovenia for a certain amount of time. So what is the lesson learned? There will always be this kind of things happening in the negotiation process. What is essential is to find a solution. Despite of the very dig-in position of both sides, and especially the Bulgarian side, at the end, the European Union found a way to overcome this blockade. Because both sides at a certain point understood that, especially the Bulgarian one, which was quite stubborn, let's be frank, understood that at a certain point, if you are blocking someone negotiation process, it is damaging your own position. This is what is the balance system which is working in the European Union. But what is the major issue for the Western Balkans is that, look, the implementation of what is agreed is not done in a sincere way. You know, the problem is you have laws which are similar to the laws which apply to the European Union or to European Union member states. But how you implement the laws, that's another issue. And in the Western Balkans, the problem is that these laws are not implemented in the way to bring the country closer to the European Union, but are used to fortify the existing power structures in the country. That's the problem. One of the solutions might be, and this is one of the ideas which I am quite promoting, is let's start with a sort of transferring good practices from the European Union to the candidate countries. For example, European Public Prosecutor's Office is a very successful tool in protecting the financial interests of the European budget and public money. So let's apply this mechanism also for the candidate countries, related at the beginning only to the funds coming from the European Union. I think this would make a huge change. It will change the nature of the judiciary in the candidate countries. It will change the way how the judiciary in those countries is working. And this will be one of the change which might at the end also change the political culture in the candidate countries. This is a huge step, I would say. I know that it will be faced with a huge resistance from the candidate countries, but this is one of the steps which might be taken or should be taken to enhance the enlargement process, because this will bring also insurance to those member state countries which are reluctant to accept the enlargement, because the corruption issues related to organized crime is one of the topics which is closely internal politically related to the enlargement process. And this is, I would say, a solution which answers to many questions at once.
Thank you very much, Mr. Groschel. Let's go back to the physical panel here, Srdjan.
Yeah, I'd like to agree what Clement said, but I would like to add one element that I missed, and this is there is no exclusive guilt that can be awarded exclusively to the candidate countries. We are witnessing the crisis of trust, and this crisis of trust lasts now for years. So it is obvious that answering to your question, what is required is not just enlargement of the EU, but it's deepening that needs to be done simultaneously. And this is why this is so difficult and complex, because it's very difficult to persuade the candidate countries to behave in a certain way if these requirements are coming from a club that doesn't hold to its own rules. Until the countries which are jeopardizing the rules and values of the very club are free to do what they want, they're creating a perfect alibi for the candidate countries to see, but why should I change if this is the model of behavior within the EU? So it's quite obvious that the enlargement debate needs to be held hand in hand with the deepening of the EU debate, discussing how to change the decision-making rules, how to adjust it in order to deliver certain rights and demand certain obligations from the members. That would create a better atmosphere and better understanding. And we need to have a common agenda for that. We need to set the time, and we need to set it on a paper. We need a common agenda of how to integrate Europe until 2030. To write it down next year, it's a perfect opportunity, 20th anniversary of the Thessaloniki summit, when the whole Western Balkan enlargement project was started. It's an excellent opportunity to reset the trust, to rediscover the trust, and put on paper what is required on this process in order to start building a confidence on both sides. It's a strategic interest of both sides. But we need to have a common understanding what does enlargement and deepening means at this moment for Europe, for European Union, and for the future member states.
We have had some proposals in recent years, even before 2022, about how to reform the enlargement process, how to also reform the decision-making process in the European Union to make enlargement more successful. One of these ideas that comes as well from the European Policy Center is the so-called stage accession project or proposal. What is your opinion about this staged accession proposal? Like, could it solve some of the issues, at least, that we currently have when it comes to EU enlargement? Could this principle, could this reform bring this kind of motivation to Western Balkan countries to focus more on their EU path than is currently the case?
Yes, but exclusively if there is a common understanding what does it requires. As I said, this is a part of enlargement, but it needs to be coupled with the deepening of the EU at the same moment. The model of staged accession, the template was developed by European Policy Center in Belgrade, but also with our colleagues, shouldn't forget them, from the Center for European Policy Studies in Brussels. It does not require changes of the founding treaties. It introduces some bold ideas. I would say this is the most sophisticated model that is currently on the table for discussion. And it aims to address the fears on the both sides. Fears of the EU that newcomers might, sneak in by not respecting certain rules and procedure, and the fears of the candidates that the accession of the EU is so far away that it's not tangible to its citizens. By introducing different stages of the accession to the EU with the clear benefits, obviously based on the very heavy conditionality, with the clear benefits in the sense of participation in the EU policies, even in EU working bodies, with increased financial support to those who are more advanced in order to converge in the economic and social sense. And mind you, this is a serious problem. We are speaking about security, but one of the aspects which is actually influencing the internal security in the region is the economic and social gap that is continuously growing between the EU and the Western Balkan countries. Citizens of Croatia will receive 10 times more from European Union than citizens in Serbia per capita. These are extremely big differences which can cause further economic and social backtracking in the region, which cannot bring anything positive. So in that sense, our model is really trying to address all these issues. It's not easy to perhaps communicate it in a layman's language. It requires a lot of insight in how EU works. But I think it's a good proposal that could be utilized. So we know how. The problem is, are we ready to how now? Are we ready to put the wheels in motion and be serious to each other that we really want the EU to enlarge? Because we are, at this moment, we are having a ripe momentum. We have new candidates. We have opening of the accession talks. But I'm afraid that there is a risk of keeping this form without, and I'm not trying to be cynical, but keeping this form without a substance if we do not change the very model of the EU accession process.
Mm-hmm. Ms. Epesci, how do you see this proposal for creating a staged accession, basically? In principle, do you think that it could resolve some of the issues we're talking about here? Would it be something that do you think would be a good solution for enlargement in the Western Balkans, and not only Western Balkans, of course?
Well, I think the issue that you addressed before, that the EU has some internal problems and we definitely also have to deal with them, I think that's a very valid point. If you're talking about enlargement, you're talking about political will from both sides, I think as the Netherlands, we're really addressing this internal problem in the EU, and we will continue to do so. And I think we're taking slowly some steps to deepen, indeed, the focus on the values again. But that doesn't mean that the political responsibility is not always also on the side of the candidate countries. I do understand that this blockade that we had with North Macedonia and Albania was very destructive, and it took much too long. And it didn't only have an effect on these two countries, it had an effect on the spirit of enlargement in the region. I think we should recognize that. At the same time, now this blockage has been resolved. It was too late, but at least now there's a solution, and these countries will start with their screening processes, and the negotiations can really take off. And now the ball, I would say, when you're talking about this stalemate in the enlargement process, the ball is really in the court of the candidates again. It's about reforms. It's about difficult choices that political actors need to make about their future. It's about making real tough decisions about who to about fighting corruption and organized crime and put your money where your mouth is. I think the time has come to do that, and there's no obstacles anymore from the Council perspective to really start this agenda of reforms. The Commission reports are very clear. There's some progress here and there, but overall, I think if you look at the fundamentals, it's not going great, and I think there should be more done. And this is really the responsibility of the candidate countries, with the assistance of the EU and bilateral member states like us. I mean, we do help, we do support in these reforms, and we want to continue to do that. So if you're looking at phased accession or staged accession, I don't think the problem is really with the modality. The problem is with the political will to do difficult reforms. So if you change the modalities, if you don't fix that problem, it will probably not change anything. We're happy to talk about phased accession and different modalities, but I think this new methodology that was introduced in 2020 hasn't been fully applied yet. There's multiple possibilities within this new methodology to do more for more, less for less, to imply conditionality, but to also speed up the process. So I would say let's give that a try first with serious commitment before changing the modalities again, because that is not the core of the problem, I would say.
I'll come to you a bit later. I just want to recapitulate once again. So we have the problem we have had before about the lack of political will for, let's say, doing the necessary reforms. But at the same time, we have this security gap in the Western Balkans, which is now much more important for the EU itself than it used to be. How do we resolve this? Is the European political community a way to basically integrate these countries in this particular framework, but not basically in the EU? Or there is some other way how to deal with this problem, which we obviously have?
Well, I think the European political community is a nice addition to what we already have. So it's definitely not a replacement of the enlargement process. The enlargement process will continue as it is. But in the European political community, we can discuss broader issues on an equal basis with our friends in the region. And I think this will help probably in the meantime to bring us closer together, in this case with the Western Balkans, and discuss serious issues of concern jointly. But it's, of course, not an alternative for the enlargement process.
Mr. Stejic, you wanted to add something to...
Yeah, well, first, let me just briefly comment on what Mr. Groschli said. With all due respect, I think the political and security concerns between Croatia and Slovenia cannot really be compared in the complexity and seriousness with the ones that we are facing in the Western Balkans, just to make this very clear. Second thing is, we can discuss all these models. In the end, it is true, no model can be the substitute for the political will. And of course, the main political agency does come from the candidate countries, absolutely, to do this and to make reforms. Nonetheless, it is also important to see, is there a real credible perspective offered that can incentivize the countries in the region? And when I talk about, and this comes down to the political will of the EU members and EU as a whole. And when you talk about stabilocracy, it's not just an empty word, that a catchphrase. My colleagues and me have just published today a report called Reclaiming the Fundamentals, which actually focuses on the technical and political flaws of the current model of accession, focusing on internal weaknesses of the process itself, the way it can be taken over by the political elites and used for actually state capturing instead, and also about the role of high politics in this whole process and how it can also be misinterpreted or taken to legitimize certain bad practices in the region. So it is also about the model that we offer. And in the end, I would like to say that it's not about maybe accelerating the process itself. Of course, there needs to be a credible perspective. This is the point. Credibility needs to be in the center of this process. And if you have a credible solution, that would be only through the true reforms. And actually, by insisting on reforms themselves in the first place, the EU would actually show serious commitment about the enlargement process being possible, because, as we all agreed, non-functioning democracies will not be accepted to the team. If you really want to see Western Balkans within, you have to insist on reforms within the Western Balkans. And of course, it comes down to both sides when it comes to the political will. But the point is there a will on the political side of the EU decision makers to actually include the Western Balkans, or leave it on the sides and actually use it as a, just to have a geopolitical interest there and keep it kind of secure as we have it at the moment? And this is the key issue for the EU, from taking about the EU standpoint.
Thank you very much. I would like to now open the floor for questions from the audience. We don't have much time left, but I think we can accept 2 or 3 questions, if there are any. I see one raised hand there. Can somebody bring the microphone? Do we have more questions? Maybe we can pick up 2 or 3 questions and then have them all answered at the same time, or no? Okay. One more hand. So 2. Okay, that's quite doable.
Hello, Mikhailo Samos, New Geopolitics Research Network, Ukraine. I have a question to the panel. What do you think about the not joining, but maybe collaboration between Ukraine, Moldova, and Western Balkans accession enlargement process? I support that all of you that both sides, I mean, European Union and candidate countries should pay more attention on their responsibilities, but I am sure from Ukrainian experience that European Union should play more geopolitical responsibility on transformation. So I remember from Yanukovych time, it was very difficult to expect from Ukrainian authorities to make reforms and do not allow Ukraine to be an association member or association agreement before reforms, but it was easier to propose Ukrainian association agreement and after this demand about reform. So my question, what do you think about the collaboration and joining maybe process of Western Balkans and Ukraine, Moldova? Because if you're talking about Eastern Partnership program or project, I think that now it doesn't work at all. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Zweers.
Thank you very much. My name is Wouter Zweers from the Klingendael Institute in the Netherlands. I have a question on the European Commission's recommendation of candidate status for Bosnia and Herzegovina. My question is whether the panel sees this as a sign that the EU, in this new geopolitical context, is taking enlargement serious again, and that it is engaged with the region and tries to bring the process forward, or rather that it is a sign of these sort of stabilitocracy dynamics that were discussed in the panel, and may actually ignore realities on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have one more question, perhaps, from the audience? Please, Mr. Dimitrov.
Nikola Dimitrov, the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, and a former foreign minister of North Macedonia. I couldn't agree more with the position that, the job of government today is to deal with the problems of today, of the citizens, and tomorrow. But I don't think it's fair to blame candidate countries for introducing issues, identity politics and historic revisionism. I think the case of North Macedonia and Bulgaria happened the other way around. We had a member state that imposed issues of history and identity on the candidate country. And the other member states couldn't find sort of the political courage around the table to say, we don't do this. Not in this century, not in this European Union. This has nothing to do with the Copenhagen criteria. So now, and I think it's slightly more nuanced. I regret to say it, but I think the problem is actually not solved. But the problem is interlinked with the accession process. And in the negotiating framework, there is a reference to the bilateral protocol that includes the work of historians. So the progress of North Macedonia towards the Union will not be only about fighting corruption and organized crime and aligning the acquis and in all the other areas, but it's going to be also about these historical issues. So I think what we need is, I think we have to be honest about things. It's a shared responsibility and it's a shared stake for a common success. And I think now that we regretfully included issues of history in an accession process, let's do it in the European way. And one way to help is to have some European presence in the room where historians will speak. Because you cannot have it both ways. It cannot be, you cannot make a bilateral issue a European issue, but still refuse a witness in the room. I can say a lot more, but I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask for volunteers to answer to each of the three questions. We don't have much time left, so I would ask you to be brief, like 1 minute per answer. Like, who would like to answer the first question from Mr. Seamus?
No.
Please, volunteers, okay?
Yes, sure. Fully agree with you that the processes of Ukraine, Moldova, and also Georgia should be combined with the enlargement processes of the Western Balkans. The Commission has already agreed that next year in the progress report and in the enlargement packages, these countries will be included. And I would hope that these countries can learn from each other and stimulate also debate amongst each other. How do you do this, and what can we do to proceed together? So all the same rules apply to all candidates and potential candidates. So it would be good from next year to have that all taken jointly.
Second question from Mr. Sturgeon.
On Wouter's question, but it's very closely linked to our Ukrainian colleague's question as well. If the process doesn't change, then I'm afraid that Bosnia and Herzegovina, as well as our newcomer candidate countries, are there for a long ride. And this is what I was referring to when I said that these symbolical gestures are so important at this stage, at this moment in European history, that they got the candidacy status. But if we do not fill the substance in this status issue, I'm afraid that there is a long and bumpy ride that is not going to be to the benefit of citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina, Ukraine, and Moldova. And by the way, there are initiatives which are clearly inviting regional governments to engage more openly, initiatives coming from civil society, to engage much more actively with the governments of Ukraine, Moldova, even Georgia, in order to exchange the experience and to help the newcomers to hit the ground running, ready for what is required. And finally, on Nicola's remark, I fully agree, and this is what I referred when I said that there is a trust that needs to be regained. We don't trust each other at this moment. We don't trust that doors are open, and you do not, I mean you, when I say you, I mean EU 27, do not trust that we are serious about what are requirements to join the EU. And that needs to be mitigated.
May I say something? Or
very briefly, we are already running late.
Yeah.
Please.
Okay. On the identity issues, look, what was happening between North Macedonia and Bulgaria was toxic. That's definitely true. But you know, it's not the first time this happened. So there are many historic issues. You know, if you listen what some European politicians, which are now getting into the certain governments, were talking, the issues could escalate also in Slovenian case. So this is what is important, is that we do keep solving these issues, as I said before, on the principles which are in place in European Union. On stage accession, I'm in favor of it, but there is a risk, because certain member countries are very supportive of this. This is, for example, Hungary, for specific reasons. What I don't want is, and what I expect with the candidates country status for Bosnia, is to have an equal level playing field, and this would be also good for Kosovo, because I think that what we need in the future is that European Commission and European Union will need to engage more actively with the candidate countries. And I think that the moment for this is coming. What I'm worried on the other side is if the political elites in the candidate countries are ready for this kind of, let's say, conditional intervention, because the tools are there. Methodology did change because of this, because there are some political decisions which have clear implications on the enlargement process. On the deepening, I would avoid connecting deepening of European Union with enlargement process, because this could become a vicious circle without clear end. And this is, I think, that the enlargement process should be enhanced. It should be more focused on conditionality combined with implementation. And if you were listening to me very carefully, this what I was proposed is only one stage, because we were talking about the stage accession. This is one in the field of judiciary, because the rule of law chapter is the most demanding one, and let us not forget, it is the only condition which is not negotiable at the end. If you don't meet the rule of law criteria, you cannot enter the European Union. This is why I'm in favor of stage accession in the economic, social part, but at the same time, we need to do a lot more on the rule of law and the democratic principles and values of the European Union.
Thank you very much. Mr. Steri, just very briefly.
Just one sentence. I think all of these issues, Ukraine, Bosnia and Herzegovina, North Macedonia, come down to the same thing. Is this political messaging to say, okay, we want to keep some kind of illusion of enlargement alive, to keep the presence of Europe on the ground, and to kind of preserve stability if it's possible? Or is it actually putting a real credible perspective of on the enlargement, which can be only done through reforms. And the question is, on the EU side, actually, does EU want to be an ally in the process of democratization of the region as well?
Thank you very much. As the moderator of this panel, I will take the liberty to conclude what we have discussed here. And my conclusion, at least, is that the EU enlargement in the Western Balkans is more important than it used to be, but all the challenges we faced before are still there. And it comes down to political will, both in the countries in the Western Balkans and the EU member states, to basically change the current situation and to move things forward. Thank you very much for being with us.
That way. No problem. Thank you all very, very much for that great panel. And there was an awful lot there. But one thing when we talk about EU enlargement, I think we need to drill into rule of law in the European Union. And I'm hoping that our keynote speech by Vera Jourova, the Vice President of the European Commission, with the portfolio of values and transparency, will dig into that. Because we can talk about rule of law in candidate countries, but I spend a lot of my time in Hungary and Poland, for example, and there are deep questions about the rule of law in those member states as well. So, yes, so is Madam Jourova up? Do we have her? No, we don't. So I'm going to talk a little bit more here as well. So, yeah, I don't really know. How did everyone enjoy that panel? Does anyone have any gripe with the EU enlargement process that they just want to shout out and get it off their chest? Because there is an awful lot. And I think that one of the things, for me, I've spent quite a bit of time talking to Moldovans and Ukrainians recently about the EU enlargement process. And they have told me that one thing that they really think that is going to happen very, very quickly for them. And I think one thing that isn't really relayed is that this is going to take a very, very long time for Ukraine and Moldova. And then I think as well, adding on to this conversation, is the enlargement of the EU is ultimately going to change the EU itself. And I think we need to start having very frank and honest conversations about what an enlarged European Union is going to look like, what its voting systems are going to look like. And I think that that's something that we need to start now rather than down the line, because there was talk there about North Macedonia and Bulgaria. And I don't think that one member state blocking up the entire process can't keep happening as we go forward. So that's all I have to say about EU enlargement. Do we have Ms. Jourova? Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so Madam Jourova is going to speak for 15 minutes, and she'll be touching on her portfolio and in relation to the Western Balkans. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Let me start by thanking the organizers for inviting me to discuss these important issues. I am absolutely certain that democracy is under the attack of autocracy, both within the Union's borders and, as we have seen in Ukraine, beyond those borders. Indeed, the unjustified Russian war of aggression against Ukraine shows that democracies and fundamental rights are under threat. Unfortunately, resurgent authoritarian regimes are not afraid to resort to the use of force to pursue their own goals, and this will not change in the next future. In this difficult and uncertain context, promoting democracy and the rule of law and defending fundamental rights is more important than ever. These values are what makes us different from autocracies like the regime in the Kremlin. And their promotion applies to our relations with enlargement countries, as well as with our broader neighborhood and beyond. This is not about ideology or some abstract goals. As someone who spent most of her life in authoritarian Czechoslovakia, the democratic values are tangible rights and freedoms to every citizen. So I am convinced about that based on my own experience. We, as Czechs and Slovaks, wanted to join the EU, to have these rights and freedoms guaranteed and enshrined in law. This conference theme is about the future of Europe, and I have no doubts that the Western Balkan countries belong to the EU. It will have to be a collective effort of citizens, authorities, EU institutions, partner countries, and member states. But I have no illusion that we depend on each other for our mutual security and prosperity. I think it is worth asking a question why authoritarianism is so dangerous. There are many reasons, from individual oppressions to the desire to control every aspect of our life. But I think most importantly, authoritarian rules do not count with the opinion of people. They do not care about their prosperity. If they cannot rule by popularity, they will rule by fear. The authoritarian rules think that the state and his faith are equal. This is why they cannot be trusted in the international fora. Putin's regime tries to rewrite established borders despite what was agreed about Europe's security architecture. If we let him, he will not stop there. This is why our duty to support Ukraine is not stemming from empathy alone. It is in our own self-interest to reject the rule by force and to promote the rule of law instead. So how do we translate this into practice? For the enlargement countries, this means having stable democratic systems that respect the rule of law and fundamental rights at the very core of the EU accession process. Our latest annual assessment, released earlier this month, calls on our partners to do more to eradicate corruption, to fight organized crime, and to ensure coherent and consistent efforts to contain and effectively address elements of state capture. In the context of the accession negotiations, the functioning of democratic institutions is now part of the so-called fundamentals cluster, along with the rule of law, the economic criteria, and public administration reform. Progress made on these fundamentals will determine the overall pace of negotiations. The EU will open accession negotiations with this cluster, and negotiations will only be closed once all necessary progress is achieved. Creating a stable democratic system also means putting in place an effective framework for preventing corruption. That is why anti-corruption policies are key in the process of the negotiations. We will also pay particular attention to empowering civil society. Civil society organizations in the enlargement countries are generally, according to the law, free to operate and carry out their activities. But the legal framework needs to be further improved and consistently implemented. This includes, for example, registration processes, enhancing transparency of public funding, and conditions for volunteering. In addition, the protection of media freedom is key to ensure accountability of those in power and proper information and choice for the people. Accountable governments and democratic institutions are crucial not only for the EU's accession process, but most of all to ensure benefits for the citizens of the candidate countries. This is why we will continue to support our partners in this area, in enlargement countries and our neighborhood alike. This is a very important message also to our friends in the Western Balkan countries. But we can only preach to others on the rule of law if we keep our own house in order. And indeed, the rule of law is central to the proper functioning of the EU, be it its area of freedom, security and justice, or our internal market. Threats to the rule of law challenge the legal, political, and economic basis of the EU. Deficiencies in one member state will have an impact on other member states and on the EU as a whole. And so none of us should ever become complacent. We can never take democracy and the rule of law for granted. This is why we are working on 3 fronts. 1, to promote a shared rule of law culture across the European Union. 2, to intervene early to prevent rule of law problems where they emerge. And 3, to respond effectively when we do identify significant problems in a member state. Over the past few years, we have gradually developed our rule of law toolbox to address the challenges we are facing at home. In 2020, we added a new tool to this toolbox, the annual Rule of Law report. Our 3rd Rule of Law report, adopted in July this year, deepens our assessment. For the first time, we also make recommendations as to how each member state can address the problems we identify. And also, now more than ever, we must defend our fundamental rights and values. And more than ever, we realize how much fundamental rights matter for peace in our society. Fundamental rights are about recognizing and protecting every individual in society. They are about balancing and reconciling the rights and freedoms we all want to enjoy. Respect for fundamental rights also depends on the broader context, on a democracy worthy of the name, of the rule of law, upheld in both letter and spirit by all authorities. The EU Charter of Fundamental Rights is our moral compass. It indicates one way to follow and prevents us from taking the wrong path. Our strategy also involves protecting and empowering civil society organizations and rights defenders, who are crucial for the well-functioning of our democracies. While we must nurture and uphold democratic values, we also have to be aware of the new and modern threats. One of the weapons in the arsenal of enemies of democracies is disinformation. After Russia's aggression on Ukraine, we are all witnessing a weaponization of disinformation as a constant feature of the European information space. Dehumanization of Ukrainians, blaming democracies for the increased food insecurity and high gas prices, justifying war crimes, just to name a few of the narratives which are heavily spread all over Europe and elsewhere. This is well documented daily bread and butter of the pro-Kremlin media outlets, and since the war, also the social media accounts of official authorities. Over the past 2 years, we have proposed measures to promote free and fair elections, protect journalists, and fight disinformation and interference, all while fully protecting freedom of speech. We have also proposed measures to make funding sources of political advertising more transparent and to strengthen electoral resilience. As a next step, we will put forward a Defence of Democracy package. This will further strengthen the resilience of EU democratic infrastructure against covert and malign interference from foreign actors. This package will bring covert foreign influence and shady funding to light. The aim is not to stifle or shut down our pluralistic democratic debate. It is about protecting our democracies from entities funded by or linked to third countries that may impact public opinion and the democratic sphere. This package is about making sure that our elections are free and fair, supporting a pluralistic landscape of free media, and developing civic spaces and citizen participation to bolster our democratic resilience from within. In a nutshell, this is about ensuring that the rules of the democratic game are the same for everyone, regardless of their political views. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for your attention. I am fully confident that we can work together with our partner countries in the Western Balkans to jointly defend our common values and our security. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we're on to panel 6. We have this panel and one more, and then it's a lovely evening here in Belgrade. So this panel is going to be a cracking one, I think. The EU's own illiberal challenge, authoritarians in the house and the backyard. And on this panel, I can see them there, is Natasha Kazakine, excuse me, Melissa Delovic, Salim Koru, Zhuja Jelini, and the moderator is Una Hidari.
Hello, everyone. Give us just a second to sit down and get our bearings together after that creepy video. It is an immense pleasure, despite the topic at hand, for me to moderate a panel with such illustrious panelists, because our time is short, and I believe all of them could spend the entire allotted time just discussing their own topic, the topics that they focus on. I won't be wasting much time, and I'll start with a question immediately to Zuzana Seleni. Zuzana, you come from the big, scary country of Hungary. The one that is most often spoken and mentioned in the context of authoritarianism, especially authoritarianism in the EU. Why is that, and how did it, if you can briefly talk about what authoritarianism means in Hungary today?
Well, I'm not sure we have a big country, but we definitely have a very matured illiberal autocracy or illiberal state or whatever we call it. It's definitely something we developed in Hungary in the last 12 years. And the idea behind is to do a different kind of democracy. At least this is what Viktor Orban is suggesting, that this is a democracy, it's just a different one. So there are other types of democracies than the liberal democracy we used to in the last 30 years in the West and in Europe and in the European Union. And it's very easy to sell this new type of something because it is actually very different from classical autocracies or dictatorships. It goes without violence. This is the most spectacular part of it. A bunch of people capture power without violence. And it's very difficult to notice. Things are very normal. This is also a step-by-step process, so you don't really see it from the beginning. For example, most Europeans believe that illiberalism in Hungary is since 2014, when Orban actually declared it as an illiberal state. But we actually saw it much earlier. This is something else. And until it didn't have a name, people didn't recognize that this is something very, very different and very dangerous. And of course, because it's step by step, there are no red lines. For example, the constitution which Viktor Orban's party made in 2011 was already amended 10 times. The election rules were amended since 2012 more than 20 times. So which was the point when you could say this is not a democracy any longer? Actually, I think constitutional legal advisors can tell that this was Amendment 4, which was already done in 2012, when the tasks, the competencies of state institutions were deeply changed. But the people did not really see it. So the profile of these new autocracies is very subtle. It's just happening day and day, and the power accumulation of a bunch of people, a certain elite is growing in the economic field, in state capture, and also in society in many ways. So that is why it's so difficult to speak about, because you don't know where the red lines are. You don't see this so easily.
by big, I meant bigger than life, big bad wolf, as in scary, not actual, not referring to the size of Hungary. But you make a very important point, which is that Hungary's the decline in the democracy index, or the way democratic indicators, began a lot earlier than when, way before than when the world started paying attention to it. And why weren't, since our topic at hand, just a brief follow-up question, why do you believe that at the time there weren't more triggers or more alarms being raised in Brussels about constitutional amendments and other things that were done in the country that led to what we have today?
Well, today autocrats are elected democratically, and they maintain the facade of democracy. There are elections. The thing is that over the time, the chance for peaceful transition to change a governing elite by elections is less and less. I would say that in Hungary, it's not possible any longer without a major breakout. Where we are today, after 12 years, is actually the normalization of autocracies. So we are not speaking about the democratic decline. We actually accepted autocracies within the European Union when constitutional democracy is now meant by majoritarian democracy, where participatory civic politics is changed for plebiscitary mobilization. The government is mobilizing masses in the streets to support the government, and they say this is civil society. There is a European integration based on some kind of shared values that the commissioners were speaking about, but actually there is a rising network of illiberal regimes, and we can name them and we can see them. And this is parallel with what we call the European Union. So this is a very, very different state of affairs than even 5 or 10 years ago.
To transition very quickly to another country whose European position is of relevance to this audience, Milica, why do you think, what is the relationship between Serbia and the European Union, and to what extent are they enablers, and to what extent can the EU be more involved in the country?
I would say, I'm sorry, I mean, having a sort of strange...
echo.
A strange echo, difficult to get used to it. I would think that it pertains very much to EU's relationship with countries in the neighborhood and generally EU's ability to be standard bearer of certain values, which is related to two things. One is how quickly you expect those countries, Serbia or any other country, to see the benefits of either joining the European Union integration or any other concrete benefit, meaning what is the price of non-compliance. And the second is what Zsuzsanna was talking about, how an organization which has, which is dealing with challenges within the organization, how it affects its ability to project those values in its external relations. And then I think it also has a lot to do with relationships with countries in the neighborhood becoming not burdened, but having so many, you try to address so many challenges with a single relationship. You first are trying to address the managing of migratory flows. I'm sure that Selim might mention this in case of Turkey, and I think also pertained with the Balkans. Then you're trying also to look at geopolitical challenges, you're looking at energy challenges, and therefore the agenda becomes a little bit crowded.
Yeah. It's a great segue into actually asking Selim, how would you describe the relationship between Turkey and the European Union? Because it's oftentimes observers will neglect the influence and the interconnectedness of Turkey with both member states, but also members on the periphery, or as the panel indicates, in the backyard. And how, to what extent can the Turkey influence policies in the EU, and the EU influence policies in Turkey when it comes to authoritarian and or autocratic tendencies?
Yeah, I mean, it used to be that the reform process in Turkey, especially in the 2000s, was driven by the EU package, if you will. the EU had this amazing magnetism, and it really defined in the 2000s especially, the agenda for Turkey. And it was a package of sorts in which the EU's influence was most visible, because it provides the sort of social framework, how media is supposed to behave, how civil society was supposed to behave. And behind that structure was also a very strong IMF, World Bank influence of sort of privatization and all that. That drove the agenda for the 2000s, really. And then by the time you came to the 2010s, that began to change. Turkey's domestic dynamics were basically saying, okay, well, we don't like this imposition anymore. We're going to have our own agenda, and we're going to sort of push back against what's coming in from the outside. And part of how they were able to do that is because the privatization allowed a restructuring of the country's sort of, who basically the people who owned the country, right? And basically the way the economy worked, so that at this point, more and more, they could have their own sort of pretty independent sphere of not just economics, but also politics, right? And these days, the way it works is that Turkish politics defines itself in opposition to, I think, European influence, whether real or perceived.
And how does an average Turkish citizen perceive the EU at this point?
In a very complicated way. I mean, if you were to ask people, if I were to, give you an EU passport, would you move to the EU? Vast majority of people would say yes, right? But then, if you ask them to vote, they're very likely to vote for people who have unfavorable views of the EU, right?
Why?
It's the whole, it's talked about a lot these days, the whole argument of resentment. Why, as you pointed out, why do we have to be in the backyard, so to say, right? Why do we, there's this idea that there's two halves to the world, one half that works and one half that doesn't. Why do we have to be born into the half that doesn't? And if you sort of feel your way into that sort of emotional space, you come to the conclusion that, well, it must be because the other half made it so. And in some sense, that is true, of course, right? If you look at history, if you look at the history of colonialism, of Western modernity, of course, yeah, there is a sense of vast injustice embedded in history, right? And we are born into the part of the world that lost out in the history of modernity, and we have to catch up, if you will, right?
Yeah. Just briefly, because I want to ask all the panelists precisely about what you're talking about. Before you do that, Natasha, I'd like to come to you. To what extent do you think the EU is or isn't encouraging and or enabling illiberal tendencies within itself and also on its periphery?
Yes, thank you. I think the European Union is definitely not only is not meeting the challenge of what's happening within its own club of 27 member states. I think we have to all realize that the situation is very serious. I mean, we heard what was happening in Hungary. We haven't mentioned Poland, which is the other member states with which, together with Hungary, have made a fundamental break from EU values. We were talking in the panels before. But this is acknowledged. This is not, everybody, all the reports, all the experts, everybody sees breakdown of rule of law, of respect for fundamental rights, of respect for democracy. It's all out there. So we have these two countries in the EU, and we've been hearing today whether it be from Ukraine, from Russia, from people, candidate countries, how much they consider EU as a democracy. So EU has a very serious problem, and as much as it wants to keep it away, and it would rather wait for things to settle, it may well eat it from inside. And for me, I find astonishing that we're in a space of the most sophisticated human rights system of protection, where we've had evidence in real time of what was happening. So maybe there are new phenomena, as Susie was saying, but they are now, we have the analysis of these neoliberal regimes and how they function. We have had that analysis. You would expect EU democrats and leaders will be in the forefront of this fight, and yet the disarray, the silence, the deafening silence, political silence about what this means for the EU and about what this says about the EU institutions and member states, that they were not only, they didn't do enough, but we see that the situation is getting worse. That is the last reports from the European Parliament. The situation is getting worse in those two countries and in Europe. So I do want to just insist in this moment, I mean, to be quite grave, I mean, to have some gravity, because I want to quote something that we always, as advocates working on rule of law in the EU, and all the papers usually quote him, but this is coming from the president of the Court of Justice of the EU. This is not coming from an angry politician, academic, or NGO. And he's saying, it's no exaggeration to say that the foundations of the Union based on rule of law are under threat, and that the very survival of the European project in its current form is at stake. And I'm just putting that here when we talk about the future, because it is creating immense problems for the EU. And it is a bit of a paradox that you have this non-response when this crisis that we see is arguably the only true and existential risk to the EU that we're seeing. I also find it astonishing in this, as we're talking today, with the war raging in Ukraine. When I hear, each time I hear about, EU officials, EU leaders, saying, acknowledging how Ukrainians are dying or fighting for Europe, for us, for our freedoms, for our democracy, I can't help wonder, well, what Europe is it that they're now fighting for, dying, that is not able to stand up against autocrats within?
The honor?
And I think the EU has been extremely complacent and very lazy, but also slowly undoing its own potential to uphold the values and the democracy that it has held. And I can go more into how it's done that.
Like I said, all of us have so much to say, and there's such a limited time here. Zsuzsanna, Natasha talked about Ukraine and all this, and as we've seen, Hungary has transitioned from being largely on par with the European Union when it comes to sanctions packages and gas policies that relate to the ongoing invasion of Ukraine, but now is slipping away from that. Is this a reflection? What is this a reflection of, and how does this fit into the authoritarian matrix?
Yeah, it's absolutely very directly close to the autocratic type of leadership what Viktor Orban and his government is doing. And it's this because what you said is that it's a very egoistic way forward. It's based on the idea that the West is not strong enough to maintain itself, to lead the world. And there is a maneuvering in Viktor Orban's policy, foreign policy, foreign trade relations. It's very explicit in foreign policy, but it's also elsewhere, to see where else can we move. And there are other big forces in the world. I mean, Russia doesn't seem to be such a big force any longer, and I think they are aware of this, but China definitely is. So when Orban came up to power, he already in 2010 made a in the significant shift in his foreign policy, and he loosened the European relationship very openly. He differentiated Europe from Brussels, from the European Union. So there is a kind of double language. Hungarians are very European. He is actually the most European. But we are skeptical towards the capacity of Brussels, namely the European Union. And it is possible because, as you said, the European Union is not capable. Of course, when we speak about the European Union, that's the European states, right? So it's political willingness of the member states. This is not the institution itself. But the institution, which is led by the European states, is not so capable enough, neither to stand up against authoritarian practices, governing practices, and also keeping the union together. And in this environment, Viktor Orban, who made already Hungary very dependent on Russia during the 12 years he's in power, which has Hungary is more dependent on Russia today than 10 years ago, and this happened under his leadership. He goes on his own way. As Erdogan or other similar autocrats, they just don't trust the global institution system any longer, so they try to figure out their own way. And of course, at the end of the story, this is disastrous for a small country like Hungary, because of course we do need allies. In our history, we needed strong networks in order to survive, and this is what we are losing in these days, and that's a huge problem for Hungarian future and national security, but that's actually happening now. And then this comes out in the relation that Viktor Orban goes out and makes separate deal with Gazprom, with Vladimir Putin, while at the same time he's voting for the sanctions, just losing trust, and of course destroying the unity or the competency of the EU to move together, but not completely. So this is also this kind of, this halfway. He is actually participating. He votes with the EU majority much more than when he opposes. So this is why he's always accepted, and he can always make his private deals.
And just briefly, how are citizens reacting to this? We had the anniversary of the Hungarian Revolution, and then people where the memory of being invaded by a bigger power, greater military power, and having a revolutionary spirit crushed is still so very poignant, if I'm not mistaken, in Hungary. How do average citizens react to that and react to the fact that, their country is, basically what you said, pulling itself out of global institutions and or creating more of an abrasive relationship with global institutions?
So first of all, there's not an average Hungarian any longer. Right? It's
so that's a misconception.
Divided country, and the voters of Viktor Orban, who have never been more than 30-40% of the people, believe what he says, and the majority of people who never voted for him, they think completely different way. So there is no midway through. This is also the product of this autocratic leadership. That it's not. There are two Hungary, and they're very different from each other. The other thing is that 56 in Ukraine, it's a very interesting thing, but also very typical, I think, for many other autocrats, is how such a regime is reinterpreting its own history. And for example, 1956, which is so obviously an anti-Russian revolution, Russians go home was the major slogan of the revolution, a generic slogan of the revolution. What is happening now is that Fidesz or Viktor Orban and his consultant, they are just rewriting the story that Hungarians were against a big enemy. They were the little heroes of David and Goliath, but they don't speak about Russians any longer. So it goes into this other frame of resentment that we were against the big enemy, but they were not. They can be whoever, and then the way how they narrate, they tell the story today, it reflects to the today fight against the Brussels, basically. So actually autocrats invest a lot of time and money for narratives, and it's 21st century linguists and psychologists are working on figuring out how people's mind work. It's very, very professional. And, with amateur ways, you cannot fight against these people.
It's almost too easy to transition to any Hungary topic right back to Serbia. But Milica, what would you add on to what she said? But particularly looking at the ever-strengthening relationship between Serbia and Hungary, especially on issues like energy and so forth.
I think first I owe you a part of the answer to the question of whether the EU is an enabler. And I keep thinking about it because it resurfaced.
Ever the perfectionist, so please.
The question is whether the EU is... And to what extent, I think, more appropriate than the question whether it's an enabler, whether it is equipped to deal with these challenges, why it didn't react to Hungary or Poland earlier, because the way the EU functions is you need everybody to take a decision. And obviously, knowing that this is how the organization functions, you tend to take a longer view, hoping that further down the line, things will self-correct or that the engagement will bear results. And I think once you have a member inside, it's more difficult to exercise conditionality, which I think the EU is learning to do with the pandemic fund, with the Next Generation EU funding, which is now becoming conditional. And it also has implications for those outside of the EU, because seeing how difficult it is to deal with leaders once they get inside of the European Union, then you think, okay, I mean, they may be there and I will have a relationship with them and I will pursue the agenda, but it actually makes me rethink the process of enlargement more generally. On strengthening of ties, I think it's generally...
Well, just to briefly interrupt you on this point, exactly, the EU is rethinking its approach to enlargement precisely because of the shifting dynamics, political and otherwise, on its periphery. But then when the country that ranks worst in terms of liberal democratic index is in fact the one that is the furthest along in its integration process, i.e. Serbia.
I think the real question is whether the process that lasts so very long and in which the perspective is blurred and the benefits become ultimately intangible, whether it's the right anchor for the democratization process. That's what I try to say, to what extent the EU is equipped. And I don't know whether it's rethinking enlargement only because of what's happening outside of the European Union or whether primarily what's happening inside of the European Union and seeing how difficult it is to reverse things within the European Union makes the organization also rethink what's happening outside. And I think if you look at the progress reports for various Western Balkans and for various candidate countries, now that I look at Turkey as well, they record in a very bureaucratic language, but you can make sure that progress reports of the European Union, they are all 100 pages or so. Everything is in the report. It's just how you frame the narrative so that the relationship within this context continues. So the relationship continues with an ever more distant end point and ever less clear, concrete thing, which might increase the price of non-compliance. Being a perfectionist, is it okay to transition now to the question of relationship?
It's really important.
I wouldn't be able to say much about how close this relationship is, not having been here for almost a decade now. What I can notice is that generally it's a global phenomenon, because if you look at the Freedom House reports since 2016, you see the erosion of democracy in a number of countries. And if you look at VDEM, if I'm correct, the last report assessed the level of democracy globally at 1989, meaning that all the gains that have been achieved over the previous 30 years would have been reversed. So you have a more sort of a bigger club, so to speak, and effectively what existed as power to shame leaders and societies which were not subscribing to the same set of values is eroding. And I think if you also, you have different models that you can aspire to. If we think of the end of the Cold War and the end of history, Fukuyama's thesis, it looked as if you have only one model that is functional. Now you have more models, and some countries are saying, well, you know, look at China, look at something else, and this makes it more difficult to say that there is only one functional. Now, I can imagine, and having seen some of the public opinion polls, especially those that BIPAC has done last year, that in Serbia, popularity of leaders indicates certain models that people feel closer to, and it is true that Viktor Orban ranks as one of the most popular leaders in the country.
Just briefly, if you can, how is Serbia perceived in Hungary? Because we often talk about how Hungary is perceived in Serbia, but how is the relationship perceived in Hungary, if you've been following that?
Well, I think that Viktor Orban and his government makes a lot of effort to influence, to raise its influence in the Balkans in various ways, politically, economically, and Serbia is definitely a strong partner in this, but it goes to Macedonia, it goes to Bosnia recently, Croatia, it's no question. So I think there's a lot of...
Slovenia, which
don't Slovenia, of course. So basically, Viktor Orban looks at the region as a potential partners, but also as a region of influence.
Yeah. Natasha, so there was talk about all these things that could be done, that should be done, and you very poignantly highlighted the grave state of affairs. Is there any element of optimism that you can inject as into how some things can be curtailed or slowly be rolled back?
Yes, so I'll answer this question also going back to a few things that was said. First, I just want to talk about the relation with Russia and with Ukraine. I want to again remember people of the situation in Poland. And in that case, we have a very different positioning of Poland in the region and with the EU. So what I'm getting at just here again is that, and it's back to the point you were making about these different forums, the way things are discussed with countries, clearly rule of law, human rights, democracy is not at the center of the conversation. It comes after, and you get these strange moments where, you know, suddenly EU seems lost what to do with Poland because Poland is our biggest ally and taking so much responsibility with regard to the war in Ukraine. So how can we, you know, be monitoring them on rule of law or saying that we may have concerns there? And then, you know, what we saw and what we're seeing is that they actually don't correct their course of action, take a very also recently quite EU anti-stance, and that it's a problem in its own, this nationalism that's growing very radical in the two countries. Then what was said was the EU is not equipped, and that we hear a lot from the EU itself. We're not equipped. We were there agreeing we were not prepared. You know, when it's just a fact that our tools are not there. We're too slow. We're big. And then there's the question of this, and I'm saying all this then to come to maybe more optimistic. Then there's the model issue. Of course, if you look at the model proposed by big imperialist, you know, models of China, for example, and you think of democracies of the EU, I mean, how do they think we can continue to try and compete model to model based on that? I think the EU failed also dramatically to be a pioneer in proposing some of the model, in accepting, the vulnerability it has because it's so diverse, because it's made of democracies, because it's never going to reach perfection, and because that's exactly what it is, and instead it's extremely defensive. And I think the solution is really to look towards stopping this, and I'm quite worried, this sort of self-defeating rhetoric that you have in the EU. If you look at how all the excuses they are finding, or if you look at the conversations going on with Hungarian and Polish authorities, and we have had access to numerous freedom of information requests to some of the dialogues that are going on, you see that the EU is really buying into this communication of these illiberal states. So they think, oh, but if we intervene, we're being hypocrites, because we're not perfect, and nobody's perfect, and there are many other problems, and there's something they do well. Then if we intervene or be too strong, then it will backfire. People will not support the EU anymore, and we want the EU to support. We want people to support the EU. It will cause more problem. We will sabotage our own great culture of dialogue and of compromise. And then finally, you have this quite contradictory argument that comes up of futility, which is, well, at the end of the day, we can't do anything. We know it. Our famous or infamous Article 7 proceeding needs unanimity to be triggered, to have a country lose their voting rights. We'll never reach that, so why even try things before? And I think there's absolutely need to get out of that mentality. On the tools, they have tools, and this is really a message we have to get to EU leaders. They do have tools to stop what's happening. And if I want to mention one that is going on right now, it's the conditionality tool. So this is about conditioning the EU budget allocations to Hungary. It's been triggered only towards Hungary for now, and not vis-à-vis Poland. So if we condition this amount, allocations of money to the Hungarian government to some fixing very serious rule of law deficiencies. Many steps were made. The Commission actually went so far to say, yes, we think we have a case, and 60% of the money should not be disbursed. And yet, we have another delay in the vote coming in the Council. Member States have to vote this. They have to, at last, they have a way to show that there are this general deficiency affecting the EU budget. If we have to negotiate, if indeed Hungary would come to a situation where it's seriously considering reforms, these can be discussed. This is built in the regulation. There will be time. But at some point, if you continue refusing ever to make any political statement, as these two states have, as the Parliament and the Commission said, crossed the lines of EU values, you're never going to be credible, and you're losing in this kind of cat and mouse game going on with the two countries, and EU is always behind. Now, the two positive things I do want to say is that civil society, on the other side, when I look at it, I think they don't have this double standard problem. They don't have this politically, partisanship and political games going over. And they have shown great solidarity across the borders among each other, taking the cause also of rule of law in Europe, strategizing together. We see it happening in France, in Italy now, a lot of exchanges going on. And so you do have that really important force that is there. And I think in a very rare conjunction with academia, who stepped up a lot, and with think tanks and policy analysts, to really keep hammering that there are there are ways that the EU institutions, the Commission, the Parliament, but most of all, the EU member states can move on.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Selim, Natasha talked about Poland in general, and Milica mentioned this earlier with regard to migration issues that have, propelled far-right leaders into power in most parts of the EU and on its periphery. Hungarian, Polish, and other leaders rode specifically on that migration wave to achieve some of the stability they have now, politically speaking. What is the perception of Turkey? What do, I daren't say average Turkish people anymore, and you're completely right, it's a misconception that you can put one person into a box and assume that they all vote accordingly, but if I were to hypothetically, what do average call upon an average Turkish person? How do they perceive the migration issue? How has it changed since the crisis and stuff like that? Since Turkey takes on the lion's share of migration and stemming migration towards the EU.
Yeah, I'll address that, but I like what Natasha said also about sort of how to confront, for the lack of a better word, authoritarianism or far-right nationalism in these countries. I do absolutely agree that the EU within itself has a lot more tools and should be a lot more confident in the way it handles these things. Of course, in the near abroad, it doesn't have those tools and can't do those things, but within itself, I think definitely. And also the sort of the ambivalence, the self-doubt that you see within the EU itself, I think radiates outside. So that if the EU was much more confident in its principles and in the way it handles problems within, I think the outside world would also have a lot more respect for the EU, and it would have at least some of its magnetism and sort of standing back. On migration, again, I think
considering that it was the EU-Turkey deal on migration was kind of one of the key pieces of policy that's signed between the two.
On migration in Turkey, first of all, it's a very, very new issue. I mean, especially Western Europe has for, I think, a couple generations now been a destination country for economic migrants, at least for a couple generations. For Turkey, it's very, very new, and it happened all of a sudden. And Turkey is one of those countries where things change very quickly. So within the span of maybe 5 years, maybe less, Turkey became a destination country for economic migrants, not just because of the border issues, the Syrian civil war and the wars in Iraq, but also because the government just built it that way, right? So we have lots of migration coming in from Central Asia, from different parts of the Turkic world, on different kinds of visas or without visas, right? So big, very symbolic parts of Istanbul, for example, are now destinations for migrants. Taksim Square, Istiklal Street, all those places that, if you've ever been to Istanbul, you've visited. Those places used to be places where it was just Turks most of the time, and then maybe Western tourists. Now they've changed radically in character. And this is a very new thing for Turkey, right?
How does this tie in, just with, briefly before we turn to audience questions, so I hope everyone's preparing their very exciting and intense questions, but how does that sort of correlate with Erdogan's grasp on power? Is he seen someone who's managing it, or someone who, does he use it to vilify outsiders, or how is that played?
So migration to Turkey is different in Turkey than Central Asian or Middle Eastern migration to Europe, right?
Through Turkey.
From Turkey, because in the tradition of these far right leaders, Erdogan sees the world in terms of sort of civilizations, right? And part of what he's about is about changing the structure of Turkish society to be more. I mean, he is from the Islamist tradition in Turkey, so he's not very pan-Turkist, right? He doesn't really mind if people speak different kinds of languages in Turkey, right? So parts of his government do, right? But he himself personally probably doesn't mind, right? So he wants to see a much more conservative and Islamic Turkey, and he has a thing about population, so he wants the population to grow, and the businessmen around him probably want labor costs to go down, right? All of this obviously means that more migration. The more migration, the better. And Erdogan is a very genuine person, if nothing else. So he says this in his speeches. He says, "Well, the more the better. We want people to come here. We have a tradition of opening up our gates to those less fortunate. So we want them to come." I can probably say the vast majority of the population doesn't want this, including his base, most of his base, shall we say. I think this, if I was to guess, it's probably a 15% or so of the country, or if you were to stretch it to 20, that is comfortable with migration, or at least even if it stays at this level, right? And more people coming in, but not more. Most of the country is has a pretty ethnic sense of nationalism, right? They don't want people to be of Turkey, they want people to be Turkish.
Yeah. It's fascinating, actually. So I can't see mics being passed around. Question here, question there, hi. There we go. Mic's coming up. 9 minutes, we can manage. Please keep your questions, obviously, to actual questions, not comments or statements. I know that with such a panel, there's obviously a great urge for back and forth debate, but let's do that in coffee break.
Hi, Sonia Stojanovic, board member, BCSP. 2 quick questions. You were speaking about the crisis of imagination or confidence in EU, and I've seen it also in my work with politicians and students from the West. Can you explain why what's going on with authoritarianism is not just the issue of post-communism and post-Ottoman world, but why it could happen in Western Europe? That's one question. And the second question is, what would you ask for if you could have a wish list for support of re-democratization of Hungary and Turkey? I mean, Turkey has elections soon. And for Hungary, we know it's a super difficult. Even if Orban lost, he changed the system so much that all the resources and rules would still benefit his party. So what could be done if you get back democracy again, and what kind of support would you need?
Natasha, do you want to start first? And then Zura and everyone else. And obviously Sil.
Yes, thank you very much for this question. And I think you made a point that's very important, first of all, and that comes up whenever I'm debating this question in countries that are not Eastern or Central European. You see a reaction from the floor, and I think it's part of the problem also that happened. Oh, but were these countries ever really democracies? Like, this is about, did they ever finish their transition? And I think this is also something really problematic, because if you really then engage in that debate with the activists, with the people, you realize it's not about, north, south, east, west. Yeah, there's some things that can be explained, there's some particularities. But I think when it comes to where the EU failed is certainly looking back at its own, history. I mean, fascism, imperialism, colonialism. It's not like EU didn't have serious, issues that it needs to deconstruct, to look at, to address. EU, Western and Southern member states. So this is something they have not engaged. This is something the European Union never really invested in. I mean, until this crisis, and it's been going on for more than 10 years, it was hardly impossible. I mean, you were not talking about these issues, democracy, rule of law, within the EU, in a European circle. You didn't even have funding anymore for organizations who do that. and of countries that had now joined the EU or who were old member states. This didn't exist. And I think what is quite impressive now, or makes us think, is that you're seeing that the EU is slowly coming to the realization it needs to reinvest in that making of, what is democracy, how do we renew it, who are the actors we need to support, bring on the table, and it's a question for all of us and for citizenships. And this is something it hadn't done, and we realized that in a number of countries of Western Europe in particular, there's much less even. I'm shocked that if I talk to colleagues, in Hungary, in Poland, here, in Ukraine, there's much more thinking there also about this new democracy, this new world, the big transitions, the digital, the climate, and it hasn't been thought through like that in the other countries. And I think the EU is slowly coming to that realization. It also had never monitored really what was happening within the member states. And one thing I wish you would do also, as if we could say something positive comes out of this crisis, is that it's not looking at it's refusing that it learns that there are some systemic, issues that need to be looked at in a systemic way. And because if you look at the new rule of law report, it's concerns here and there and different values, but no reflection on trends, no reflection on, the future, what does it mean, how to evaluate that. Absolutely, this is still totally lacking. And some professors, and I can share with you later, have actually done and proposed now for France what they call a resilience test on authoritarian shock. And it's quite interesting, and they've used some methodology from the European Central Bank, which does stress case on how banks can face economic breakdown, and they've used that to look at how much, in the very plausible scenario where an autocrat would become head of France, would the system survive, first of all, and so giving also ideas of how to build that democratic resilience now we hear commissioners talk about, but we don't see a lot going on. So I hope, this answers a bit.
Zsuzsa, please.
So, of course, redemocratization is a more interesting issue than learning about autocratics, because we are so bored by them by now, and that's the interesting question. And I usually say alliance building, but now I actually say that as something else, because we have tried, and Hungarian opposition now failed 3 times with trying to figure out some alliance, and it just didn't work. And a reason why, there's a lot of analysis why, but the main reason why it didn't work, because the many fractions just didn't trust it that together they can get better than individually. So this is exactly what is happening at the European level. And there is no trust that the EU can do better than individual member states. This is why Viktor Orban and whoever is doing their own business. But France is doing their own business, and Germany is also doing their own business. So there is the model in the crisis situation, and we are in crisis since 2008, that all countries try to figure out something which is better for them, and there's no leadership in the European Union which would actually show a way forward and which would create or show some kind of alternative that makes the EU really indispensable, beyond the point it is indispensable today. So this is, I think, if a couple of countries would really do something brave, that could be a change maker.
Selim, I think there was part about Turkey as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure what you mean by, what would be my wish list or what I could change. I think, the one positive, the big positive thing going on in Turkey is that young people have a radically different perception of politics, I think. And the party bosses in Turkey, I think they're all above the age of 60, well above the age of 60. So And the system is set up in a way that party bosses pretty much dominate the whole agenda. So if you could have a way to undo that, and if you could have a way of, of getting out of jail some of the very effective politicians there are, I think it'd be a much different field than it is today.
I think there was a second part to your question, but no? Can we get 2 questions? Please, sir.
No?
Does this work now?
Well, yes.
Okay. Niels Mojnieks, Amnesty International. Question. Does the war in Ukraine, is that a gift for authoritarians? Seems to be a gift for Mr. Erdogan. Is it also a gift for the Poles and the Hungarians because of the imperative of having some kind of facade of unity against Russia? And how does that play out?
Maybe.
Shall we
Yes,
hear
sorry,
the other
second
one?
part. I get distracted by people talking. Is there anyone else who wants to ask a question? No. All right. Well, yes, please.
Well, I'm not sure that the war is good for Orbán Viktor and Hungary at all. I mean, his politics is good until actually the global world is working well. Then he can do his maneuvering, which is very much built on what this globalized world made it possible. So a world which is more bipolar and makes everyone to take side, this politics doesn't work. And now he is getting to a more restricted political, space. And this is why Hungary is really isolating itself. I mean, Orbán's Hungary, I always have to specify. Because he doesn't want to take side, but he will have to. And it's his own trap. He always wants everyone to take side because he's a polarizing person, but he wants a world which is not polarized. But no, he's going to see a polarized world. So it's not good for Hungary. And I don't think it's good for Poland. It's a destroyed Ukraine is just not good for Poland in the midterm.
I know we're running out of time. I'm going to be a little autocratic and just take, again, another minute. Natasha, briefly on Poland, I think that you touched upon, just, with, again, the migration stuff and everything, Poland has gotten less flack. I feel how it's gotten less flack from the EU.
I think there's no way we can say it's a gift for Poland on no fronts, and now it's it is confronted a very dire situation. Economy it has welcomed millions of people that need to be integrated in the country. It is just near the border with the France, so I think that there's no way we can say it's a gift. I think for very small, it was very short period of time, I think, where the rhetoric of Poland being in the forefront, doing so much, we should absolve them or the Polish government of all the trouble. I think this was very short-lived moment, but they will use it in the negotiations with the European Union and the other member states.
And Milica, just briefly.
No, I would probably differentiate whether it's good for a leader or whether it's good for the country. I don't think any of this could be good for any country, but I think it could be good for. It's probably bad for pro-Russian authoritarian leaders if the primary criteria is geopolitics, we might get some authoritarian leaders on the right geopolitical side, which might mean that this agenda about which we've been talking the previous hour is again not going to dominate this relationship. But what I think the question is whether countries leveraging their purportedly neutral position can be something which not necessarily, I can imagine somebody who is not authoritarian leveraging this position, which then is a different question, I think.
Yeah. Well, that's it for now. Would really encourage you, thank you so much for your time, would really encourage everyone in the public to read and follow the work of the panelists. If you didn't catch the names at the beginning, they're all in the booklet. I got lost in thought thinking about the about all the possibilities of with which the authoritarian and illiberal tendencies in the EU and outside of it could be challenged, and I hope you enjoyed it too. Thank you so much. Someone else will come and do something else now. And if you have more questions, obviously, we can all have them in the coffee break. Thank you.
Thank you, Una.
There's a coffee break now, so enjoy your coffee, and I'll see you back here in, I think, is it 10 minutes?